Sometimes, the loneliest moments in life prepare us for the most extraordinary friendships. For 20 years, Hank Archer had accepted that his best days were behind him, living alone in his mountain cabin with nothing but memories and regret for company. Then one winter night in 1887, he found a wounded creature in the snow that would change everything. This wasn't just any animal. It was 8 feet tall, covered in white fur, and had eyes that seemed to understand every word Hank spoke. As he nursed the creature back to health, Hank discovered something incredible. This being could think and reason better than most men he'd ever met. They began having conversations that lasted deep into the night about life, loss, and what really matters as we grow older. But when the outside world learns about Abel, Hank faces an impossible choice. How do you protect the one friend who helped you remember what it means to truly live? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Sierra Nevada mountains in the winter of 1887 were a place where a man could disappear entirely from the world, and Hank Archer had done exactly that. His cabin sat nestled in a grove of ancient pines at nearly 8,000 feet, accessible only by a treacherous trail that most folks wouldn't dare attempt even in summer. The structure itself was solid work, hewn logs chinked tight against the mountain cold, a stone chimney that drew clean, and windows positioned to catch the morning sun while keeping the worst of the winter winds at bay. Hank had built it with his own hands 23 years ago, back when his hair was still more brown than gray, and his hands moved with the confidence of a man who believed the future held promise. He'd planned it as a retreat, a place where he and Mary could escape the bustle of Sacramento during the hottest months. She'd loved the idea, had even helped him plan the layout, sketching little additions on brown paper, a covered porch where they could sit in the evenings, a root cellar carved into the hillside, space for a garden where she could grow the herbs she favored for her cooking. Mary, even now 2 decades after the consumption had taken her, Hank still felt her presence in the careful way he arranged his few possessions. Her wedding ring, a simple gold band he'd bought with his first month's wages from the lumber mill, hung on a leather cord around his neck, worn smooth by years of his thumb, worrying across its surface during the long mountain nights. He'd never been able to bring himself to remove it, not even when the well-meaning folks in town had suggested it might be time to move on, to find companionship again. The cabin held reminders of the life they'd planned, but never fully lived. Her recipe book still sat on the single shelf above the small table where he took his meals, its pages yellowed, but the careful script of her handwriting still clear. He could read her notes in the margins, add more sage next to the venison stew recipe, Hank's favorite, beside the instructions for sourdough biscuits. Sometimes, on the loneliest evenings, he'd cook from those pages, following her directions exactly. And for a few moments, the cabin would smell like it had when she was alive. When laughter came easy, and the future stretched ahead like an uncharted trail full of possibilities. His daily routine had become as predictable as the mountain seasons. Wake before dawn, stoke the fire that he banked each night, check the traps he set for small game, tend to the few supplies he needed to see him through each winter. He'd grown skilled at reading the mountain's moods, when a storm was building, by the way the wind shifted through the pines, when the snow would be too soft for travel, by the particular silence that settled over the peaks. The nearest town was Truckee, a hard day's ride down treacherous slopes even in good weather, and Hank made the journey only twice each year, once in late fall to stock up on coffee, sugar, and ammunition, and once in early spring to trade furs for the few manufactured goods he couldn't make or do without. The townspeople remembered him as a different man. Before Mary's death, he'd been gregarious enough, quick with a joke and generous with his time when neighbors needed help with barn raising or harvest. He'd served honorably in the war, though he rarely spoke of those years, and had earned enough respect in the community that folks still tipped their hats when they saw him on his infrequent visits. But they'd learned not to ask too many questions about his mountain life, had come to understand that whatever healing Hank Archer was doing up there in the high country, it was work best done alone. The truth was, Hank had made peace with solitude in ways that surprised even him. There was satisfaction in the simple mechanics of survival, splitting wood with clean, efficient strokes, maintaining his rifle so it would fire true when game presented itself, reading the sky for weather signs that could mean the difference between life and death at altitude. He'd developed a relationship with the mountain itself, learned to appreciate the subtle changes that marked each season's passage. The way morning light painted the eastern peaks gold in summer, how the first snow transformed familiar landmarks into an alien landscape, the particular quality of silence that came with deep winter when even the wind seemed to hold its breath. His nearest neighbors were the creatures that shared the mountain with him, a family of mule deer that browsed near his cabin each evening, so accustomed to his presence they barely lifted their heads when he stepped onto the porch. The red-tailed hawk that nested in the tall pine behind his woodshed, whose piercing cry had become as familiar as his own voice. Bears that gave his cabin a wide berth, understanding somehow that this particular human was no threat as long as they respected the invisible boundaries he'd established around his small clearing. He'd grown comfortable with the rhythm of his own thoughts, the way memories would surface unbidden during the long winter evenings. Sometimes he'd find himself speaking aloud to Mary, updating her on small changes to their mountain, as if she was sitting across from him at the rough-hewn table. He'd tell her about the family of foxes that had denned near the creek, or describe the particular beauty of sunrise after a fresh snowfall. These conversations felt natural, necessary even, a way of maintaining connection to the man he'd been when love had made him whole. The war had taught him that men could endure far more than they believed possible, and the years since Mary's death had proven that truth in ways he'd never expected. He'd discovered reserves of resilience he hadn't known he possessed, learned to find meaning in small things, the perfect draw of his bow, the satisfaction of a well-banked fire that would burn steady through the night, the taste of coffee brewed strong and black on a morning when the temperature dropped below zero. But lately, as winter deepened and the mountain settled into the profound quiet that came with heavy snow, Hank had begun to feel something he couldn't quite name. Not loneliness exactly. He'd made his peace with that long ago. This was different. A restlessness that seemed to build with each passing day, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath in anticipation of something momentous. He'd noticed small changes in the behavior of the animals that shared his territory. The deer seemed more skittish, abandoning their usual browsing grounds for reasons he couldn't determine. His traps remained empty for days at a time, even when he set them along trails that had been reliable for years. Most unsettling of all, he'd found tracks in the snow near his cabin, enormous prints that didn't match any creature he recognized, too large for a bear and shaped wrong for anything else that might wander this high into the mountains. The tracks appeared sporadically, never following a clear pattern, sometimes circling his cabin at a distance before disappearing into the dense timber that climbed toward the highest peaks. They were old when he found them, filled with wind-blown snow and difficult to read clearly, but their size and depth suggested something massive, something that moved through the mountain terrain with surprising stealth for its apparent bulk. On this particular evening, as February wind howled around the cabin's corners and snow pelted against the windows with the persistence of thrown sand, Hank sat by his fire working a piece of pine with his carving knife. The block of wood was destined to become a chess piece, a replacement for a pawn he'd lost years ago when he'd knocked the set from the table during a particularly vivid dream about the war. Chess had been one of the few skills he'd carried away from his military service, learned during the long months between campaigns, when soldiers needed something to occupy their minds besides the memories of what they'd seen and done. He'd carved the entire set himself during his first winter alone on the mountain, working by firelight with tools Mary had given him for his birthday the year before she died. Each piece was unique, bearing the small imperfections that marked them as the work of human hands rather than machine precision. The bishops wore the faces of mountain peaks, the knights resembled the deer that visited his clearing, and the pawns stood like small sentinels, each slightly different from its fellows. Playing against himself had become a meditation of sorts, a way of exercising his mind while his hands stayed busy with the small tasks that filled his evenings. He'd position the board so that he faced different sides for each move, forcing himself to consider strategies from both perspectives, to think several moves ahead while simultaneously planning defenses against his own attacks. Tonight, though he found his attention drifting from the carved piece in his hands to the sounds outside his cabin, the wind carried something different, a quality he couldn't identify, but that raised the fine hairs along his forearms. It wasn't the usual mountain noise, the sigh of wind through pine boughs or the distant crack of ice adjusting to temperature changes. This was something else, something that spoke to instincts honed by years of war and wilderness living. As he sat listening, Hank's fingers found Mary's ring through the fabric of his shirt, and he realized that for the first time in many years, he was genuinely curious about what tomorrow might bring. The feeling was unsettling after so many seasons of predictable routine, but not entirely unwelcome. Perhaps the mountain was finally ready to share whatever secret had been building in the long silence of winter. He finished the chess piece as the fire burned low, testing its weight and balance, before adding it to the set arranged on the board. 23 years of mountain winters had taught him to read the signs that spoke of change approaching, and every instinct he possessed suggested that this particular winter night would mark the end of something old and the beginning of something entirely new. The sound that woke Hank from restless sleep wasn't the familiar crack of settling timber or the whisper of wind through the eaves. It was something else entirely, a low, pained sound that seemed to rise from the very bones of the mountain itself. He lay still in his narrow bunk, listening to his own heartbeat while his mind catalogued the possibilities. Not a bear. The sound was too deliberate, too filled with what could only be described as anguish. Not wind, though the storm still raged outside with undiminished fury. The sound came again, closer now, and Hank recognized something disturbingly human in its cadence. Someone was out there in the storm, and from the tone of that cry, they were in serious trouble. He rolled from his bunk and reached for his clothes, dressing quickly in the pre-dawn darkness. His rifle stood propped beside the door, loaded and ready as always. But something told him this wasn't a situation that would require weapons. The wind nearly knocked him backward when he opened the cabin door, driving snow into his face with stinging force. The storm had intensified during the night, transforming his familiar surroundings into an alien landscape of white chaos. Visibility extended no more than a few yards in any direction, and the cold bit through his heavy coat within seconds. But the sound came again, definitely closer. Somewhere near the tree line that bordered his small clearing, Hank pulled his hat low and stepped into the storm, following instincts honed by decades of mountain living. The snow was knee-deep and still falling, each step requiring deliberate effort as he broke trail toward the sound. His breath formed ice crystals that the wind whipped away before they could settle, and already he could feel the familiar bite of cold working through his gloves. What he found at the base of a massive pine tree challenged everything he thought he understood about the natural world. The creature lay on its side in a depression it had apparently scraped in the snow, and even hunched in obvious pain. It was enormous, easily 8 feet long and covered in thick, white fur that seemed to glow with its own inner light against the storm's darkness. At first glance, Hank's mind tried to categorize it as a bear, but the proportions were all wrong. The limbs were too long, the torso too narrow, and the head was shaped like no animal he'd ever encountered. Elongated but not quite human, with a pronounced brow ridge and features that suggested intelligence far beyond any beast. But it was the eyes that stopped Hank cold in his tracks. Even in the creature's obvious distress, those eyes held a depth of awareness that made his skin crawl with recognition. This thing was looking at him, not as prey or predator, but as one thinking being regarding another. Dark stains in the snow around the creature told the story of serious injury. Blood had soaked through the white fur along its left side, and Hank could see where something claws, or perhaps a fallen branch, had opened several deep gashes. The creature's breathing was labored, each exhale producing clouds of vapor that the wind immediately dispersed. As Hank stood frozen in indecision, the creature made that sound again, not quite a growl, not quite a moan, but something that conveyed both pain and what seemed like frustration. Then, impossibly, it turned its massive head toward him and made a different sound, softer, almost questioning. The intelligence in those dark eyes was unmistakable now, and Hank felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain cold. Every instinct told him to back away, to return to his cabin and pretend he'd never seen this impossible thing. But Mary's voice seemed to whisper in his memory, reminding him of the countless times she'd tended injured birds and small animals, never once turning away from something that needed help. "A creature in pain is just a creature in pain," she used to say. "Everything else is just fear talking." Hank took a cautious step forward, his hands raised in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. The creature watched him approach, but made no aggressive move, though Hank could see the tension in its massive frame, the way it tracked his every movement with predatory awareness. When he was close enough to touch it, he slowly knelt in the snow, trying to assess the extent of its injuries. The wounds were deep but not fatal, though blood loss and exposure would certainly kill the creature if left untreated. Hank had field-dressed enough game to recognize the difference between superficial damage and serious injury, and this definitely fell into the latter category. But more troubling was the creature's reaction to his presence. Instead of the fear or aggression he would have expected from any wild animal, it seemed to be studying him with an intensity that suggested it was making some kind of evaluation. "Easy there," Hank murmured, his voice barely audible above the wind. "I'm not going to hurt you." The creature's response nearly made him fall backward into the snow. It made a sound that was unmistakably an attempt at vocalization, not the grunts or roars he would have expected, but something that sounded almost like speech, though in no language he recognized. The tone was questioning, even conversational, and those intelligent eyes never left his face. Hank sat back on his heels, his mind reeling with implications he wasn't ready to consider. Whatever this creature was, it was far more than a simple animal. The evidence was overwhelming. The deliberate attempts at communication, the obvious intelligence in its behavior, the way it seemed to be waiting for him to make a decision about what happened next. The storm showed no signs of abating, and Hank knew that even his own survival was questionable if he remained exposed much longer. But the creature's condition was deteriorating rapidly. Already its breathing had become more labored, and the dark stains in the snow were spreading. Whatever choice he made had to be made quickly. "Can you understand me?" he asked, feeling foolish but somehow compelled to treat this encounter as a conversation rather than a wildlife situation. The creature's response was immediate and unmistakable. It nodded, actually nodded, and made that vocalization again, this time with what sounded like urgency. Then it did something that nearly stopped Hank's heart. It raised one massive clawed hand and pointed toward his cabin, then back at itself, then at the cabin again. The meaning was clear. It was asking for help. In 30 years of mountain living, Hank had seen bears, mountain lions, wolves, and every other predator the Sierra Nevada had to offer. He'd learned to read animal behavior, to distinguish between aggression and fear, between territorial displays and genuine threats. But nothing had prepared him for this, a creature that appeared to be engaging in actual communication, that seemed to understand not just his words, but the larger situation they both faced. The decision, when it came, felt inevitable. Mary would have made the same choice without hesitation, and despite all the years of grief and isolation, Hank discovered that some part of him was still the man she'd fallen in love with, the one who couldn't turn his back on something that needed help. "All right," he said, standing slowly and brushing snow from his knees. But this is going to be interesting. Getting the creature to his cabin required more courage than anything Hank had done since the war. It was obviously weak from blood loss, but still possessed strength that dwarfed his own. More than once, as he helped it struggle through the deep snow, Hank wondered if he was making the last mistake of his life. But the creature seemed to understand that he was trying to help, moving carefully and deliberately, never making any gesture that could be interpreted as threatening. By the time they reached the cabin door, both man and creature were exhausted. The storm had worsened, if such a thing were possible, and Hank's small clearing was rapidly disappearing under fresh snowfall. Getting the creature through the doorway required some creative maneuvering. It had to hunch down and squeeze through sideways, but eventually they both stood inside, dripping melted snow onto the rough wooden floor. In the warm glow of the banked fire, the creature looked even more impossible than it had outside. Its fur was thick and lustrous, more white than any natural animal Hank had ever seen, and its features, while definitely not human, held an expressiveness that was deeply unsettling. But it was the way the creature looked around his cabin that truly gave Hank pause. Those dark eyes catalogued every detail with obvious intelligence, lingering on the chess set, the books on his shelf, Mary's recipe collection. It was clearly taking inventory, learning about him from his possessions in a way that spoke of sophisticated reasoning ability. As he helped the creature settle near the fire and began gathering supplies to treat its wounds, Hank Archer realized that his 20 years of solitude were about to end in the most extraordinary way imaginable. Whatever this creature was, whatever it wanted, his mountain would never feel quite the same again. The first 3 days passed in a strange routine that challenged everything Hank thought he knew about the natural order. His unexpected guest proved to be a surprisingly cooperative patient, allowing Hank to clean and dress its wounds with a stoicism that reminded him of soldiers he'd known during the war. The creature, for lack of a better word, though Hank was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with that designation, seemed to understand the necessity of treatment and submitted to his ministrations with what could only be described as dignified patience. By the second morning, when the storm finally exhausted itself and pale sunlight streamed through the cabin windows, Hank had confirmed what he'd suspected during that first impossible encounter. This being possessed intelligence that rivaled and perhaps exceeded that of most humans he'd known. It watched everything he did with obvious comprehension, learned the routine of his daily activities with remarkable speed, and demonstrated an understanding of cause and effect that went far beyond animal instinct. More unsettling still was its apparent grasp of human customs. When Hank prepared his simple breakfast of coffee and fried cornmeal, the creature observed carefully but made no attempt to take food without permission. When offered water, it drank carefully from the tin cup Hank provided, handling the vessel with surprising delicacy given the size of its hands. Most remarkably, it seemed to understand the concept of personal space, positioning itself near the fire for warmth, but never encroaching on areas of the cabin that were clearly Hank's domain. It was on the third evening, as Hank sat at his small table working on the chess set he'd been carving, that their first real communication occurred. The creature had been watching him work with obvious interest, its dark eyes following the movement of his knife as he shaped a replacement pawn. When Hank finished the piece and set it on the board with the others, his guest made a soft sound that was unmistakably questioning. "Chess," Hank said, feeling somewhat foolish, but compelled to respond as if to a curious child. "It's a game. 2 players move pieces across the board, trying to capture the other's king." The creature's response was immediate and startling. It rose from its position by the fire and approached the table, moving with careful deliberation. Up close, its size was even more impressive. Standing nearly 8 feet tall, it had to hunch its shoulders to avoid hitting the cabin's ceiling. But despite its intimidating bulk, its movements were graceful, almost refined. What happened next left Hank speechless. The creature studied the chessboard for a long moment, then reached out with one massive finger and touched the white queen. It looked at Hank expectantly, and when he nodded, it moved the piece forward 2 squares in a perfectly legal opening move. "You know chess?" Hank asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The creature made that vocalization again, a complex sound that seemed to contain multiple tones, almost like speech, but in no language Hank recognized. But its meaning was clear enough. It wanted to play. What followed was the most extraordinary chess match of Hank's life. His opponent, for that's clearly what this creature was now, demonstrated not just knowledge of the game's rules, but genuine strategic thinking. Its moves were deliberate and considered, each one part of a larger plan that became apparent only as the game progressed. More than once, Hank found himself facing tactical situations he hadn't anticipated. Forced to reconsider strategies he'd thought sound, the creature won the first game in 27 moves, delivering checkmate with a combination that displayed both creativity and deep understanding of positional play. As Hank studied the final position, trying to understand where he'd gone wrong, his opponent made a sound that could only be described as gentle amusement. "Well," Hank said, resetting the pieces for another game, "I haven't been beaten that soundly since I played Colonel Morrison back in '65. At the mention of that year, the creature's demeanor changed subtly. It tilted its head in a gesture that was unmistakably questioning, and Hank realized it had recognized the historical reference. "The war," he explained, still not quite believing he was having this conversation. "The Civil War, you know about that?" The creature nodded, definitely nodded, and made a series of vocalizations that sounded almost like speech. The tones rose and fell with the cadence of language, and while Hank couldn't understand the words, the meaning seemed to be affirmative, even knowledgeable. Over the following hours, as they played game after game by firelight, Hank began to experiment with different topics of conversation. His guest, for he could no longer think of it as merely a creature, seemed to understand far more than it could verbally express. References to historical events, mathematical concepts, even philosophical ideas seemed to register with obvious comprehension. Most remarkably, it began to demonstrate what could only be called empathy. When Hank mentioned Mary during one of their conversations, speaking aloud as he often did, though now to an actual listener rather than empty air, his guest's entire demeanor shifted. It made soft, sympathetic sounds and actually reached out to touch Hank's shoulder with surprising gentleness. The gesture was so unmistakably compassionate that Hank felt tears spring to his eyes for the first time in years. "You understand loss," he said. Not really asking a question, the response was a long, mournful vocalization that conveyed more about grief and loneliness than words ever could. In that moment, Hank realized that whatever this being was, wherever it had come from, it knew something about suffering and solitude that matched his own experience. As the week progressed, they developed a routine that felt almost natural. Mornings were for practical matters, tending the fire, preparing food, checking on his guests' healing wounds. The injuries were mending with remarkable speed, faster than should have been possible for any normal animal. Afternoons were often spent in what could only be called conversation, though Hank did most of the talking while his companion listened with obvious attention and responded with those complex vocalizations that seemed to carry meaning beyond his ability to interpret. Evenings belonged to chess. The wooden set became their primary means of communication. Each game, a dialogue conducted through strategy and tactics. His guest proved to be not just competent but brilliant, demonstrating an understanding of the game that surpassed anything Hank had encountered. More than that, it seemed to enjoy not just winning, but the intellectual challenge itself. The pure pleasure of minds engaged in complex competition. It was during their 7th game together that Hank made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. As his companion studied the board, clearly several moves ahead in its planning, Hank realized he needed to call this being something other than creature or guest. The intelligence behind those dark eyes deserved better than generic. Designation. I'm going to call you Abel, he said suddenly, the name coming to him from some half-remembered corner of his mind. If that's all right with you. The being looked up from the chessboard and made a sound that was unmistakably pleased. Then it did something that nearly stopped Hank's heart. It pointed to itself and repeated the name back to him, the syllables somewhat distorted by vocal cords not designed for human speech, but recognizable. Abel. From that moment forward, everything changed. Abel wasn't just an intelligent creature that had wandered into his life. He was someone with thoughts and feelings, someone capable of friendship and loss, someone who had chosen to trust a lonely mountain man with secrets that might shake the foundations of everything humanity thought it knew about its place in the world. As Hank lay in his bunk that night, listening to Abel's steady breathing from his place by the fire, he realized that for the first time in 20 years, he wasn't alone. More than that, he was looking forward to tomorrow, curious about what new revelations their continuing conversations might bring. The transformation in Hank's daily routine was subtle but profound. For the first time in 2 decades, he found himself considering another's needs when planning his activities. Abel's presence brought an unexpected warmth to the cabin that had nothing to do with the additional body heat from his massive frame. There was something deeply comforting about sharing space with another thinking being, about the gentle sounds of companionship that filled the silence he'd grown so accustomed to. Abel's wounds healed with remarkable speed, and as his strength returned, his personality began to emerge more clearly. He possessed an almost childlike curiosity about human customs and possessions, spending long periods examining objects that Hank had long taken for granted. Mary's recipe book proved particularly fascinating to him. He would hold the small volume with surprising delicacy, studying the handwritten pages with obvious interest, occasionally making soft vocalizations that sounded almost like questions. "Those are recipes," Hank explained one morning as he prepared his usual breakfast of coffee and cornbread. "My wife Mary wrote them down. Instructions for cooking different foods." Abel's response was immediate and intense. He held up the book and made a series of complex sounds, his tone clearly questioning. Then he pointed to Hank, then to the book, then made a gesture that encompassed the entire cabin. The meaning was unmistakable. He was asking about Mary, about what had happened to her. Hank felt the familiar tightness in his chest that always accompanied thoughts of his lost wife, but for the first time in years, the pain was accompanied by something else, a desire to share those memories with someone who seemed genuinely interested in understanding. "She died," he said simply, sitting down across from Abel with his morning coffee. 20 years ago come spring. Consumption took her. We'd only been married 3 years. Abel's reaction was remarkable in its gentleness. He made a low, mournful sound and reached across the table to touch Hank's hand with one massive finger. The gesture was unmistakably compassionate, and Hank realized that this being understood grief in a way that spoke of personal experience. Over the following days, as Abel's strength continued to return, their conversations became deeper and more complex. Though Abel couldn't speak in words Hank could understand, his vocalizations grew more nuanced, and he became increasingly adept at using gestures and expressions to convey meaning. More importantly, he proved to be an exceptional listener, responding to Hank's stories with obvious engagement and what seemed like genuine emotional investment. Hank found himself talking about things he hadn't spoken of in years. He told Abel about his courtship of Mary, about their dreams of building a life together in the mountains, about the terrible months when the consumption slowly stole her strength and breath. He spoke of his time in the war, of friends lost and battles won, of the way violence could change a man in ways he never fully understood until years later. Through it all, Abel listened with an attention that was both flattering and slightly unnerving. Those dark eyes never wavered from Hank's face, and his responses, the soft sounds of sympathy, the nods of understanding, the occasional gentle touch, suggested a depth of empathy that challenged everything Hank thought he knew about intelligence and emotion. But it was the questions Abel began to ask, conveyed through increasingly sophisticated gestures and vocalizations, that truly amazed Hank. Abel seemed particularly interested in human customs around death and grieving, in the concept of marriage and partnership, in the way humans formed emotional bonds with one another. His curiosity wasn't idle. It felt like the careful inquiry of someone trying to understand a foreign culture from the inside. One evening, as they sat by the fire playing their nightly chess game, Abel did something that took Hank completely by surprise. He rose from his position across the small table and moved to the shelf where Mary's recipe book sat. He brought it back and opened it to a page that Hank recognized immediately. Mary's instructions for venison stew, complete with her marginal notes about seasoning and cooking times. Abel pointed to the page, then to the cold pot that sat on Hank's small stove, then back to the book. His meaning was clear. He wanted Hank to cook from Mary's recipe. "You want me to make a stew?" Hank asked, surprised by the emotion that tightened his throat. Abel nodded emphatically and made a sound that was unmistakably encouraging. Then he did something even more remarkable. He pointed to himself, then to Hank, then made a gesture that seemed to encompass both of them together. He wanted to share the meal, to participate in this connection to Mary's memory. Cooking the stew became an unexpectedly moving experience. As Hank followed Mary's careful instructions, reading her notes aloud and explaining the reasoning behind each step, Abel watched with fascination. He seemed to understand that this was more than simple food preparation. It was a ritual of remembrance, a way of keeping love alive across the barrier of death. When the stew was ready, fragrant with the herbs Mary had favored and thick with the vegetables she'd always insisted made the difference between mere sustenance and true nourishment, Hank served it in his two best bowls. Abel accepted his portion with obvious gratitude, and they ate together in comfortable silence. The only sounds, the crackling of the fire, and the occasional appreciative noise from Abel as he sampled the meal. After they'd finished eating, Abel did something that nearly brought tears to Hank's eyes. He took the empty bowls to the basin where Hank usually washed dishes and began cleaning them with careful attention to detail. The gesture was so domestic, so considerate, that Hank realized his understanding of companionship was being fundamentally altered. "Thank you," Hank said simply, and Abel's response, a warm, almost musical vocalization, suggested he understood not just the words, but the deeper gratitude they represented. As the weeks passed, Hank began to notice changes in himself that went beyond the simple pleasure of having company. Abel's presence seemed to awaken parts of his personality that had been dormant for years. He found himself laughing occasionally, something that had been rare since Mary's death. He paid more attention to small details of comfort and appearance, keeping the cabin neater and taking more care with his meals. Most significantly, he began to feel something he'd almost forgotten: hope. Not hope for any specific outcome or change, but the general sense that tomorrow might bring something interesting, something worth experiencing. Abel's obvious intelligence and growing emotional connection to their shared life created a sense of possibility that Hank hadn't felt in decades. But even as their friendship deepened, Hank couldn't shake a growing awareness that this situation was temporary. Abel's presence on his mountain was clearly some kind of anomaly, and anomalies had a way of attracting attention. More than once, he'd noticed changes in the behavior of local wildlife that suggested other humans might be moving through the area. Tracks in the snow that didn't belong to him or Abel, distant sounds that could have been voices carried on the wind. For now, though, those concerns seemed distant and manageable. What mattered was the warmth of companionship, the pleasure of intellectual stimulation, and the unexpected gift of friendship that had wandered into his life during the worst storm he could remember. Whatever challenges the future might bring, Hank Archer was no longer facing them alone. It was on a clear March morning, when the worst of winter had finally loosened its grip on the mountain, that Abel revealed the true extent of his extraordinary knowledge. Hank had stepped outside to check his snares and returned to find Abel, seated at the table with a piece of charcoal from the fire, working on something with intense concentration. What he saw when he approached made him stop dead in his tracks. Spread across several sheets of precious paper, torn carefully from the back of one of Hank's few books, was a detailed map of the night sky. But this wasn't a crude sketch or the rough approximation an intelligent animal might produce. This was a precise, mathematically accurate representation of stellar positions, complete with constellation patterns, planetary movements, and celestial coordinates that would have impressed the most learned astronomers of the day. "Good Lord," Hank whispered, leaning over Abel's massive shoulder to study the work more closely. "How do you know all this?" Abel looked up from his drawing and made a complex series of vocalizations, his tone suggesting he was attempting to explain something difficult. Then he pointed to his own eyes, made a sweeping gesture toward the sky, and tapped the paper with one clawed finger. The meaning seemed clear. He had observed these patterns himself over time. But as Hank examined the star chart more closely, he realized something that made his skin crawl with implications he wasn't ready to consider. Some of the notations on Abel's map referenced stellar positions that would only be visible from Earth at different times of year, different seasons than the current one. More troubling still, there were markings that seemed to indicate changes in star positions over periods far longer than any single lifetime of observation. "How long have you been watching the stars?" Hank asked quietly. Abel's response was a long, contemplative sound that seemed to carry weight beyond simple vocalization. Then he held up his hands and began a complex counting gesture, using his fingers in combinations that suggested numbers far larger than 10. When he reached what appeared to be his intended total, he looked at Hank with those dark, ancient eyes and made a sound that was unmistakably significant. The number, as best Hank could interpret it, was somewhere around 300. 300 years, Hank asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Abel nodded solemnly and returned to his star chart, adding details that spoke of centuries of careful observation. As he worked, he began to vocalize in what sounded almost like song, complex tonal patterns that seemed to follow the mathematical relationships he was drawing on paper. The effect was both beautiful and deeply unsettling, as if Hank were listening to knowledge being passed down through generations in a language far older than human speech. Over the following days, Abel continued to reveal aspects of his knowledge that challenged everything Hank thought he understood about the world. He demonstrated understanding of mathematical principles that wouldn't be formally recognized by human science for decades. He showed familiarity with geological formations that suggested deep knowledge of how mountains were formed and changed over vast periods of time. Most remarkably, he seemed to possess detailed information about weather patterns, animal migrations, and seasonal changes that spoke of observations spanning multiple lifetimes. But it was Abel's knowledge of human history that truly amazed Hank. Through carefully constructed gestures and increasingly sophisticated drawings, Abel began to share observations about human civilization that painted a picture of someone who had been watching mankind's development from a careful distance for centuries. He drew maps of settlements that had existed before Hank was born, showed understanding of political changes and territorial expansions that suggested he had witnessed westward expansion from its earliest stages. When Hank mentioned his service in the Civil War, Abel's reaction was immediate and informed. He drew quick sketches that clearly depicted battle formations, weapon types, and tactical situations that demonstrated not just theoretical knowledge, but the understanding of someone who had observed warfare firsthand. His drawings of military camps, supply lines, and strategic positions were accurate enough to make Hank wonder if Abel had been watching human conflicts from the shadows for decades. "You've seen wars before," Hank said, Not really asking a question, Abel's response was a deep, mournful sound accompanied by gestures that clearly indicated multiple conflicts, many deaths, cycles of violence that repeated across generations. For the first time since they'd begun communicating, Hank sensed genuine sadness in Abel's demeanor, a weight of accumulated grief that spoke of watching countless human tragedies unfold from a position of helpless observation. The implications of Abel's apparent longevity began to weigh heavily on Hank's mind. If this being had truly been alive for centuries, watching human civilization develop and change, what did that make him? What kind of creature possessed both the intelligence to understand complex mathematical and scientific principles and the lifespan to observe their practical application across multiple generations? More troubling still was the question of why Abel had chosen to reveal himself now to this particular human in this remote location. Clearly, he had managed to remain hidden from human discovery for centuries. What had changed? What circumstances had led him to risk exposure by approaching Hank's cabin during that winter storm? As if sensing his growing disquiet, Abel began to demonstrate what could only be described as concern for Hank's emotional state. He would interrupt his various projects, the star charts, the mathematical diagrams, the detailed maps of mountain terrain, to check on his human companion, offering gentle touches and soft vocalizations that seemed designed to provide comfort and reassurance. One evening, as they sat by the fire playing their customary chess game, Abel did something that illustrated both his remarkable intelligence and his growing understanding of human psychology. Instead of playing to win, as he usually did, he began making moves that were clearly designed to create interesting tactical situations for Hank to solve. He was teaching, using the game as a means of intellectual stimulation rather than simple competition. "You're trying to make me better at this," Hank observed, studying a position that was clearly designed to test his understanding of a particular strategic concept. Abel's response was a warm sound that was unmistakably affirmative, accompanied by a gesture that seemed to encompass both of them. He was investing in their relationship, using his superior knowledge to help Hank grow intellectually. The gesture was so generous, so fundamentally caring, that Hank felt a wave of emotion that surprised him with its intensity. But even as their friendship deepened and Hank marveled at the daily revelations of Abel's knowledge and wisdom, a nagging worry grew in the back of his mind. The winter isolation that had protected their unlikely partnership was beginning to break down. Snow was melting, mountain passes were becoming accessible again, and with spring would come the possibility of other humans venturing into these remote areas. More concerning were the signs he'd begun to notice around his property, subtle disturbances that suggested someone had been observing his cabin from a distance. Broken branches in places where no animal would travel, boot prints in melting snow that didn't match his own, the feeling of being watched that came from instincts honed by years of military service and mountain living. Abel seemed aware of these signs as well. Hank had noticed him becoming more alert during their outdoor activities, more careful about exposure, more attentive to sounds and movements that might indicate approaching humans. Whatever secrets Abel carried, whatever knowledge he possessed, that went far beyond normal human understanding, both of them were beginning to realize that their peaceful coexistence might soon be tested by forces beyond their control. The first concrete evidence that their mountain sanctuary was no longer secure came on a grey April morning when Hank made his weekly trip to check the snares he'd set along the lower mountain trails. Hidden beneath a pile of last autumn's leaves, partially buried but clearly not placed there by natural means, he found a folded piece of paper that made his blood run cold. The document was official government correspondence, marked with the seal of the United States Geological Survey, but the content had nothing to do with mapping or mineral rights. Instead, it contained detailed instructions for field agents investigating reports of unusual wildlife activity in the Sierra Nevada region. specifically mentioning large, unidentified tracks and possible encounters with unknown species of exceptional size and apparent intelligence. Most chilling of all was a hand-drawn map that clearly showed the general area around. Hank's cabin, marked with notations about probable habitat zones and recommended approach routes for capture operations. The date on the document was only 3 weeks old, meaning government agents had been planning this investigation while he and Abel were developing their friendship in blissful ignorance of the approaching threat. Hank folded the paper carefully and made his way back to the cabin with his mind racing. How much did they know? How long had they been watching? And most importantly, how much time did he and Abel have before this remote mountain sanctuary became the center of a government operation that would destroy everything they'd built together? Abel's reaction to the document was immediate and profound. As Hank explained what he'd found, showing Abel the official seals and translated portions of the text, his friend's demeanor changed in ways that were both subtle and alarming. The easy confidence that had characterized Abel's movements was replaced by a tension that spoke of long-held fears finally being realized. His vocalizations became quieter, more urgent, and his eyes took on a quality of alertness that suggested he was constantly listening for sounds that might indicate approaching danger. Through a series of increasingly sophisticated gestures and drawings, Abel began to share information that explained both his presence on the mountain and his reaction to the government document. The story that emerged was heartbreaking in its implications and terrifying in its scope. Abel's kind, for he was clearly not alone in the world, or had not always been, had once lived in small communities scattered throughout the wilderness areas of North America. They were ancient, possessed of intelligence that surpassed human capabilities in many areas, and had learned over centuries to remain hidden from the expanding human population that increasingly encroached on their traditional territories, but hiding had become progressively more difficult as human technology and organization improved. What had once been vast wilderness areas became settlements, then towns, then cities. Railroad construction, mining operations, and westward expansion had systematically eliminated the remote areas where Abel's people could live undisturbed. Worse still, the few encounters between his kind and humans had invariably ended in tragedy, either for his people, who were hunted and killed out of fear, or for humans, who were harmed by frightened beings defending themselves with strength far beyond human capabilities. Abel's drawings told a story of systematic retreat, of communities broken up and scattered as human pressure increased. Family groups, for Abel's gestures suggested complex social structures built around kinship bonds, had been forced to separate, some seeking refuge in the most remote areas they could find, others simply disappearing into regions so inhospitable that even their hardy species could barely survive. The most devastating revelation was Abel's indication that he believed himself to be the last. Through combinations of gestures, vocalizations, and carefully drawn symbols, he conveyed a solitude that went far beyond anything Hank had experienced. While Hank had lost his wife and chosen isolation, Abel had lost his entire species and had isolation forced upon him by circumstances beyond his control. "How long have you been alone?" Hank asked, though he dreaded the answer. Abel's response suggested decades of solitude, of watching and waiting and hoping that somewhere in the vast wilderness others of his kind still survived. His decision to approach Hank during that winter storm hadn't been random. He had been observing human behavior from a distance for years, learning to distinguish between those who might be trusted and those who posed threats. Hank's obvious grief, his self-imposed exile, his gentle treatment of the mountain's wildlife had marked him as someone who might understand the value of difference, the necessity of sanctuary. But now that sanctuary was threatened, and Abel's long experience with human nature told him exactly what would happen if government agents succeeded in confirming his existence. He would become a specimen, a subject for study and experimentation. proof of biological possibilities that would revolutionize scientific understanding while destroying everything that made his life worth living. As they discussed their options, primarily through Abel's increasingly sophisticated communication methods, it became clear that both of them faced impossible choices. Hank could potentially protect himself by denying knowledge of Abel's existence, claiming ignorance of anything unusual in his mountain territory. But such a denial would mean abandoning the first true friendship he'd experienced since Mary's death, condemning Abel to face government capture alone. Abel, for his part, could disappear back into the wilderness, seeking some new refuge in even more remote territories. But his gestures suggested that such options were increasingly limited, that the expanding human presence had eliminated most of the areas where his kind could survive undetected. More than that, his obvious attachment to their friendship made it clear that leaving Hank would be as difficult for him as it would be for the mountain man. The document Hank had found included timeline information that suggested government agents would begin their systematic search of the area within 2 weeks. That gave them little time to prepare for whatever course of action they chose, and both men seemed to understand that their peaceful coexistence was entering its final phase. But even as external pressures mounted and difficult decisions loomed ahead, the bond between them continued to deepen. Abel began sharing knowledge that went beyond simple survival information or historical observation. He taught Hank mathematical concepts that illuminated natural patterns he'd observed but never understood, showed him astronomical relationships that revealed the mountain environment as part of vast cosmic systems, shared philosophical perspectives that had been developed over centuries of solitary contemplation. In return, Hank found himself opening up about aspects of his past that he'd never discussed with anyone, including Mary. His experiences during the war, the specific reasons he'd chosen mountain isolation, his fears about growing old, alone, and forgotten, all of it became part of their ongoing conversation, shared with someone who seemed to understand not just the words, but the deeper emotional truths they represented. As the deadline established by the government document approached, both Hank and Abel seemed to understand that whatever happened next would test not just their friendship, but their fundamental beliefs about loyalty, sacrifice, and what makes life worth living. The easy days of chess games and philosophical discussions were ending, replaced by the urgent necessity of decisions that would determine whether their extraordinary friendship could survive in a world that had no place for such unlikely alliances. The revelation came 3 days before the government agents were scheduled to begin their search, delivered in the form of an object that Abel had clearly been reluctant to share. As they sat by the dying fire after their evening chess game, Abel rose with unusual solemnity and disappeared into the shadows near the cabin's far corner, where Hank had assumed he simply rested during the day. But instead of settling into sleep, Abel began moving stones and debris that Hank had thought was simply part of the cabin's foundation. What emerged from Abel's careful excavation was a leather-bound journal wrapped in oiled cloth, a book that was clearly ancient but remarkably well preserved. The leather was soft with age, but showed no signs of rot or damage, and when Abel placed it reverently on the table between them, Hank could see that it was thick with hundreds of pages, covered in careful script. "What is this?" Hank asked, though something in Abel's demeanor suggested he was about to learn something that would change everything he thought he understood. Abel's response was a complex series of vocalizations accompanied by gestures that seemed to indicate both great importance and deep reluctance. Then he opened the journal to its first page, and Hank found himself looking at handwriting in multiple scripts, some that appeared to be English, others in languages he couldn't identify, and still others in symbol systems that looked more like mathematical notation than any human writing he'd ever seen. But it was the date on the first page that made Hank's hands shake as he held the ancient volume. Written in clear English script at the top of the page, June 15th, 1587, the first year of my observations of the newcomers to this land. 1587, Hank whispered, looking up at Abel with dawning comprehension. You've been keeping this journal for 300 years. Abel nodded gravely and began turning pages, showing Hank entry after entry, documenting the arrival and expansion of European settlers across North America. But these weren't the observations of a detached observer. They were the carefully recorded experiences of someone who had been actively studying human civilization, learning languages, understanding political systems, and most remarkably, predicting patterns of human behavior with startling accuracy. The journal contained detailed maps of settlements before they were established, drawings of technological innovations years before their widespread adoption, and most unnervingly, predictions about human expansion patterns that had proven correct decades after they were written. Abel hadn't just been watching human civilization develop. He had been analyzing it, understanding it, and documenting it with the thoroughness of a scholar whose lifespan allowed for observations impossible to any human researcher. "You knew?" Hank said, his voice barely above a whisper as the implications became clear. "You knew they would come looking for you eventually." Abel's response was a sound that conveyed both affirmation and profound sadness. Then he turned to a section of the journal that was clearly more recent, pages covered with observations about government expeditions, military operations, and systematic efforts to catalogue and capture unusual specimens found in frontier territories. The documentation was meticulous and terrifying. Abel had been tracking government interest in his kind for decades, watching as official policies shifted from simple dismissal of frontier, tall tales, to active investigation and capture. Operations. Most chilling of all was a series of entries that detailed the fates of other members of Abel's species who had been discovered by human authorities. The accounts were clinical in their precision, but devastating in their implications. Captured beings subjected to medical experimentation, others killed while attempting to escape confinement. Some simply disappeared into government facilities, never to be seen again. Abel's journal documented a systematic elimination of his people that had been going on for over a century, conducted with bureaucratic efficiency and scientific curiosity, but no consideration for the intelligence and emotional complexity of their subjects. But the revelation that truly shattered Hank's understanding came when Abel turned to entries dated just months before their first meeting. The pages contained detailed observations of one Henry Hank Archer, mountain man and Civil War veteran, including information about his daily routines, his emotional state, his history with his deceased wife, and most unsettling of all, analysis of his psychological profile that suggested he would be an ideal candidate for contact. "You chose me," Hank said, the words coming out flat and emotionless as he processed the implications. "You didn't just happen to get injured near my cabin. You planned this." Abel's response was immediate and intense, a series of vocalizations that seemed to be attempting explanation, justification, perhaps even apology. But the evidence in his own handwriting was undeniable. For months before that winter storm, Abel had been studying Hank from a distance, learning his patterns, understanding his psychology, and ultimately making the calculated decision that this particular human would be sympathetic to his situation. The injury that had brought them together hadn't been entirely fabricated. Abel's wounds had been real, caused by a fall while he was conducting surveillance of government agents in the area. But his decision to approach Hank's cabin rather than treat his injuries in the wilderness had been based on careful analysis of human behavior patterns, documented over 3 centuries of observation. Even more disturbing was Abel's notation that government interest in the area hadn't been triggered by random reports of unusual activity. Someone had been feeding information to federal authorities, providing them with detailed intelligence about possible locations for cryptozoological specimens. The systematic nature of the search operation suggested that officials knew far more about Abel's kind than they were admitting publicly. "They know you exist," Hank said, studying pages that documented government communications about asset recovery and specimen acquisition. "They've known for years, Abel's affirmative response was, accompanied by gestures indicating that the current operation was only the latest in a series of capture attempts that had been growing more sophisticated and better coordinated over the past several decades. What Hank had interpreted as a random government investigation was actually a carefully planned operation based on years of intelligence gathering and previous failed attempts to capture members of Abel's species. But the most devastating revelation came in the journal's most recent entries, written in the days since Hank had discovered the government document. Abel had been using their conversations not just for companionship, but as opportunities to study human emotional responses, decision-making processes, and loyalty patterns. Every chess game, every shared meal, every moment of apparent friendship had been documented with scientific precision, analyzed for insights into human psychology that could be useful for predicting government behavior. The man who had believed he was experiencing the first genuine friendship of his adult life discovered that he had been an unwitting subject in a centuries-long study of human nature. Abel's affection for him might be real, but it was built on a foundation of calculated manipulation that called into question everything they had shared together. How much of it was real? Hank asked, his voice hoarse with emotion he was struggling to control. Abel's response was the most complex vocalization he had ever produced, filled with tones that suggested multiple layers of meaning, regret, justification, genuine emotion, and something that might have been desperate appeal for understanding. Then he did something that surprised Hank completely. He reached across the table and gently closed the journal, then pushed it toward Hank with obvious reluctance. The gesture was clear. He was giving Hank access to 3 centuries of accumulated knowledge about human civilization, trusting him with secrets that could revolutionize scientific understanding, offering him information that governments would kill to possess. It was either the most generous gift imaginable or the most sophisticated manipulation Hank had ever encountered. As he sat holding the journal that contained the documented observations of 3 centuries, Hank realized that his understanding of Abel, their friendship, and his own situation had been fundamentally altered. The being he had thought of as a friend in need was actually a brilliant strategist who had manipulated their entire relationship from the beginning. But the intelligence that had made such manipulation possible was the same intelligence that had produced centuries of careful observation, genuine scientific inquiry, and what appeared to be authentic emotional connection. The approaching government agents were no longer just a threat to their peaceful coexistence. They were the latest players in a game that had been running for centuries, with stakes that went far beyond one man's friendship with an unusual creature. And Hank Archer, who had thought he was simply helping an injured being, found himself holding documentation that could change human understanding of intelligence, longevity, and their place in the natural order of the world. The morning after Abel's revelation brought with it a tension that seemed to hang in the mountain air like the promise of a storm. Hank had spent the night reading through portions of the ancient journal, his understanding of history, human nature, and his own place in the world shifting with each carefully documented observation. By dawn, he felt as though he were seeing everything, the cabin, the mountain, even his own memories, through entirely new eyes. Abel had withdrawn into himself since sharing the journal, sitting motionless by the dying fire with an air of resignation that spoke of someone who had revealed his deepest secrets and was now waiting to face the consequences. When Hank finally closed the journal and looked up to meet those dark, intelligent eyes, the silence between them carried the weight of everything that had changed overnight. "How long have you been planning this?" Hank asked, his voice steady, despite the turmoil in his thoughts. Abel's response was complex, involving gestures toward the journal, then toward himself, then toward the larger world beyond the cabin. The meaning seemed to be that planning was perhaps too simple a word for what had been a gradual recognition of necessity. an understanding that his kind's survival might depend on finding humans who could be trusted with the truth. But it was what Abel produced next that truly illustrated the depth of his preparation for this moment. From the same hiding place where he'd concealed the journal, he withdrew a small wooden box, clearly handmade, with joints so precise they suggested craftsmanship that went beyond anything Hank had seen. Inside, wrapped in soft leather, was a collection of items that told the story of a friendship that had been both genuine and calculated from its very beginning. There was a perfectly carved chess piece, a king that matched the style of Hank's set but was made from a different wood, carved with details so intricate they seemed to shimmer in the morning light. Beside it lay a small metal object that Hank recognized as a military decoration, though not one he'd ever seen before. The medal was clearly old, bearing symbols and inscriptions that suggested it belonged to no army or nation he could identify. "You were a soldier," Hank said, examining the medal more closely. "Not just an observer. You fought in human wars." Abel's affirmative response was accompanied by gestures that suggested multiple conflicts, different armies, various identities assumed over decades of careful infiltration. The implications were staggering. This being had not only observed human civilization from a distance, but had actively participated in it, learning firsthand about human nature under the extreme conditions of warfare. The third item in the box made Hank's breath catch in his throat. It was a small daguerreotype photograph. The image faded, but still clear enough to show a Union Army encampment that Hank recognized immediately. He had been there during the siege of Petersburg, and as he studied the photograph more closely, he could make out familiar faces, including his own, younger and thinner, standing beside men he had known and fought with and watched die. "You were there," he whispered, looking up at Abel with a mixture of awe and something approaching fear. "You were watching me 30 years ago." Abel's response indicated not just observation, but active participation. Through a series of careful gestures and vocalizations, he conveyed that he had been present during several battles of the Civil War, sometimes as a scout working behind enemy lines, sometimes as a medic treating wounded soldiers, always careful to maintain identities that would not attract attention or raise questions about his true nature. The photograph had been taken during one of the war's bloodiest periods, when Union forces were bogged down in trench warfare that seemed to have no end. Hank remembered those weeks as some of the darkest of his military service, constant threat of death, diminishing supplies, the gradual realization that victory would come only at a cost that might exceed anything the country could bear. But Abel's presence during that period hadn't been coincidental. Through increasingly sophisticated communication, he revealed that he had been studying human behavior under extreme stress, documenting how men responded to impossible situations, learning to identify those who possessed the psychological resilience that might make them suitable for eventual contact. Hank's behavior during the siege, his care for wounded comrades, his refusal to abandon difficult positions, his ability to maintain hope even in seemingly hopeless circumstances had marked him as someone worth remembering. "You've been planning this for 30 years, Hank said. The words carrying both accusation and amazement. Abel's response suggested that planning was again too simple a term for what had been a gradual process of evaluation and preparation. But yes, Hank had been identified decades ago as a potential ally, someone whose character and circumstances might eventually make him suitable for the kind of trust that Abel was now placing in him. The revelation transformed Hank's understanding of his own life in ways that were both flattering and deeply unsettling. His choice to retreat to the mountains after Mary's death, his years of solitary existence, even his decision to help an injured creature during a winter storm, all of it had been observed and analyzed by someone whose understanding of human psychology exceeded anything Hank had imagined possible. But the most significant item in Abel's collection was a folded document written in Hank's own handwriting, a letter he had never sent, written to Mary during one of the war's most difficult periods. He had carried it with him for months, adding to it during quiet moments when the need to communicate with her had become overwhelming. Eventually, he had thrown it away, unable to bear the reminder of how much he missed her voice, her counsel, her simple presence in his life. "How do you have this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Abel's explanation involved gestures toward the photograph, then toward the letter, then toward himself. He had retrieved it from the trash pile behind Hank's tent, recognizing even then that it revealed something essential about the young soldier's character: his capacity for deep love, his ability to maintain emotional connection across impossible distances, his willingness to be vulnerable, even in circumstances where vulnerability could be fatal. The letter contained passages that Hank had forgotten writing, expressions of love and longing that revealed the depth of his emotional life even during wartime. But more than that, it contained philosophical reflections about the nature of sacrifice, the meaning of loyalty, and the question of what made life worth living, even in the face of inevitable loss. Reading his own words 30 years later, Hank could see why Abel had identified him as someone who might understand the complexities of his situation. "You knew I would help you," Hank said, "because you knew what kind of man I was before I knew it myself." Abel's response was affirmative, but also apologetic. His vocalizations suggested that manipulation had been necessary for survival, but that the friendship which had developed between them had transcended its calculated origins. The chess games, the shared meals, the long conversations by firelight, all of it had been genuine, even if it had been built on a foundation of careful planning and psychological analysis. As the morning progressed, and they discussed their increasingly limited options, it became clear that Abel's preparation extended beyond emotional manipulation and historical documentation. He had been planning for this confrontation with government forces for years, developing strategies that took advantage of his superior knowledge of mountain terrain, his understanding of human tactical thinking, and his centuries of experience avoiding capture. The cabin itself had been chosen not just for its isolation, but for its defensive possibilities. Abel showed Hank features of the surrounding landscape that he had never noticed, natural choke points that would force approaching agents into predictable patterns, escape routes through terrain that would challenge even experienced mountain climbers, cache supplies hidden in locations that could support survival during extended pursuit. But Abel's most significant preparation was psychological rather than tactical. Through their months of friendship, he had been teaching Hank to think like someone whose lifespan was measured in centuries rather than decades, to consider problems from perspectives that went beyond immediate human concerns, to understand loyalty and sacrifice in terms that transcended normal social expectations. The approaching government agents represented more than just a threat to their friendship. They were the latest attempt in a systematic effort to eliminate Abel's kind that had been ongoing for over a century. Every strategic decision, every tactical choice, every emotional response had to be considered in the context of a conflict that was far larger and more significant than one mountain. Man's relationship with an unusual creature, as they prepared for what both of them understood might be their final day together. Hank found himself struggling with questions that went to the heart of everything he valued. Was their friendship real if it had been built on manipulation? Could he trust someone who had been studying him for decades without his knowledge? Most importantly, was he willing to risk everything, his life, his freedom, his peace, for someone whose motivations he was only beginning to understand? But even as these doubts plagued his thoughts, Hank couldn't ignore the evidence of genuine affection and respect that had characterized their relationship. Whatever Abel's original motivations, their chess games had been filled with real, intellectual pleasure. Their conversations had revealed authentic emotional connection, and Abel's obvious distress at the approaching separation suggested feelings that went far beyond scientific curiosity. The morning light, streaming through the cabin windows, illuminated two beings preparing for a confrontation that would test not just their tactical abilities, but their fundamental beliefs about friendship, loyalty, and the meaning of sacrifice. Whatever happened next would determine whether their extraordinary relationship could survive in a world that had no place for such unlikely alliances. The government agents arrived exactly when Abel's journal had predicted they would, their approach marked by the subtle signs that only someone with military experience would recognize. Hank spotted them first, 3 riders moving with the careful precision of men who understood they were entering potentially hostile territory. They were still more than a mile away, dark shapes against the morning snow. But their formation and movement patterns immediately triggered instincts that Hank hadn't relied upon in decades. "They're here," he said quietly. And Abel's response was immediate, a low vocalization that carried both acknowledgement and what sounded like grim satisfaction. Whatever doubts had plagued their relationship over the past few days disappeared in the face of immediate danger. They were partners now, bound together by circumstances that demanded absolute trust, regardless of how that trust had been earned. Abel moved to the window, his massive frame somehow managing to observe the approaching riders without creating a silhouette that might be visible from a distance. His assessment of their capabilities was swift and professional. These weren't local law enforcement or casual investigators. The way they moved, the equipment they carried, their obvious familiarity with mountain terrain all suggested federal agents with military training and specific experience in difficult capture operations. Hank retrieved his rifle from its position beside the door, checking the action and ammunition with movements made automatic by years of practice. But as he prepared for what seemed like inevitable confrontation, Abel did something unexpected. He moved to the corner where he had hidden his journal and withdrew his walking staff, a carved piece of wood that Hank had assumed was simply a hiking aid, but now recognized as something far more significant. The staff was clearly ancient, its surface worn smooth by countless years of handling, and decorated with symbols that seemed to shift and change in the morning light. As Abel gripped it with obvious reverence, his entire demeanor changed. The resigned sadness that had characterized his behavior since revealing the journal was replaced by something that could only be described as dignity, the bearing of someone who had decided to face whatever came next on his own terms. "You're not running," Hank observed. Though it wasn't really a question, Abel's response was a complex vocalization that seemed to contain multiple meanings. But the primary message was clear. He was tired of hiding, tired of being hunted, tired of living in constant fear of discovery. If this was to be the end of his long existence, he would meet it with the honor that his centuries of survival had earned him. The implications of Abel's decision hit Hank like a physical blow. For 300 years, this being had managed to avoid capture through careful planning, superior intelligence, and constant vigilance. His survival had depended on never allowing himself to be cornered, never giving human authorities the opportunity to confirm his existence. But now he was choosing to stand and fight, to risk everything rather than abandon the first genuine friendship he had found in decades of solitude. "You don't have to do this," Hank said. Though he already knew what Abel's response would be, the look Abel gave him contained 3 centuries of accumulated wisdom about human nature, about loyalty, about the price of relationships that mattered enough to defend. His vocalizations were gentle but firm. He had spent too many years watching his kind disappear into government facilities, had documented too many failed attempts at peaceful coexistence, had learned too much about human intentions to believe that running would solve anything. If he was going to be hunted for the rest of his life, he would at least choose the ground where that hunt ended. The approaching agents had closed to within half a mile, their movements becoming more cautious as they neared the area where their intelligence suggested they would find evidence of their quarry. Hank could see through his rifle scope that they were well equipped for a capture operation. Nets, tranquilizer weapons, communication equipment that would allow them to call for reinforcements if needed. These men had clearly done this before, but as Hank studied their approach, his military training began to assert itself in ways that surprised him. The tactical situation wasn't as hopeless as it had first appeared. The agents were operating in unfamiliar terrain, while he and Abel had the advantage of knowing every trail, every defensive position, every potential escape route within miles of the cabin. More importantly, the government men were expecting to capture a single, albeit unusual, creature. They weren't prepared for coordinated resistance from two intelligent opponents working together. "We can make this difficult for them," Hank said, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had faced seemingly impossible odds before and survived. Abel's response was immediate and enthusiastic. Whatever strategic planning he had been doing over the centuries of hiding had clearly included contingencies for situations exactly like this one. His gestures indicated familiarity with military tactics, understanding of how to use terrain to maximum advantage, and most encouragingly, confidence that they could present enough of a challenge to make the government agents reconsider their approach. As the riders drew closer and the moment of confrontation approached, Hank felt something he hadn't experienced since the war, the peculiar clarity that came from facing mortal danger alongside someone he trusted completely. Whatever manipulation had been involved in the beginning of their relationship, whatever secrets Abel had kept, whatever lies had been told or truths withheld, none of it mattered now. They were going to stand together or fall together, and for the first time in decades, Hank Archer was no longer alone. The confrontation began not with violence, but with words, as the lead government agent called out from a position of apparent safety behind a cluster of pine trees 50 yards from the cabin. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to dealing with difficult situations. But Hank could hear the underlying tension that suggested these men were far from confident about their mission. "Henry Archer," the agent called. "We know you're in there. We just want to talk. No one needs to get hurt today." Hank positioned himself at the window where he could maintain visual contact while remaining protected, his rifle ready but not immediately threatening. Beside him, Abel crouched with his ancient staff, his massive frame somehow managing to find concealment despite the cabin's limited space. The intelligence in those dark eyes was wholly focused now, calculating distances and angles with the precision of someone whose survival had depended on such assessments for centuries. "Talk about what?" Hank called back, buying time while he assessed the agent's positions and equipment. "About your house guest," came the reply. "We know he's injured. We just want to make sure he gets proper medical attention." The lie was so transparent that Hank almost laughed. But Abel's reaction was more significant, a low vocalization that carried the weight of centuries of bitter experience with human duplicity. This being had heard such promises before, had probably witnessed their consequences firsthand, and clearly harbored no illusions about government intentions. From his position, Hank could see that the three agents had positioned themselves to cover the cabin's most obvious escape routes, while maintaining fields of fire that would allow them to use their tranquilizer weapons effectively. Their formation was professional but predictable, exactly the kind of tactical approach that Abel's journal had documented in previous capture operations. But what the agents couldn't know was that Abel had been preparing for this exact scenario for decades. As Hank watched, his extraordinary friend began to move with purpose and stealth that defied his enormous size. Abel's knowledge of the cabin's construction allowed him to identify weak points in the floor and walls, creating multiple exit options that weren't visible from outside. More importantly, his understanding of mountain terrain gave him advantages that no amount of government training could overcome. "We know he's been here for months," the agent continued. "We know you've been harboring him, but we also know you're a good man, Mr. Archer, a war hero. You understand duty and responsibility. Help us help him, and this can end peacefully for everyone." The appeal to his military service was clever, but it also revealed how much the government knew about his background. These men had done their homework, had probably studied his war record and psychological profile with the same thoroughness that Abel had applied to his own observations. But their understanding was incomplete. They knew the soldier he had been but not the man he had become through 20 years of mountain solitude and recent months of extraordinary friendship. As the agents continued their attempts at negotiation, Abel produced something from beneath his furs that made Hank's breath catch. It was a scroll made from what appeared to be animal hide, covered with symbols and diagrams that seemed to pulse with significance, even though Hank couldn't interpret their meaning. Abel's handling of the document suggested it contained information of enormous importance, knowledge that had been preserved and protected through centuries of hiding. "What is that?" Hank whispered. Abel's response was complex, involving gestures toward the scroll, then toward himself, then toward the world beyond the cabin. The meaning seemed to be that this document contained everything, the accumulated wisdom of his people, scientific knowledge that could advance human understanding by centuries, philosophical insights that could reshape how mankind thought about intelligence and consciousness. It was Abel's final gift and his ultimate weapon. If he was going to be captured, if his freedom was going to end, he was prepared to offer humanity something so valuable that it might change the fundamental relationship between his kind and the human species. But the offer would come with conditions, negotiations that would require the government agents to acknowledge his intelligence and treat him as an equal rather than a specimen. "Mr. Archer," the lead agent called again, his patience clearly wearing thin. "We're prepared to wait, but not indefinitely. We know he's injured and probably suffering. The longer this takes, the worse it gets for everyone involved." But even as the agent spoke, Abel was putting his centuries of survival experience to work. His movements around the cabin were creating sounds that would mask any noise from his preparations, and his positioning suggested he was ready to implement escape strategies that would challenge everything the government men thought they knew about their quarry's capabilities. The moment of truth was approaching rapidly, and both Hank and Abel understood that the next few minutes would determine not just their individual fates, but the future relationship between humanity and intelligences that had been hiding in plain sight for centuries. Whatever happened next would test every assumption about friendship, loyalty, and the price of knowledge that could change the world. The resolution came in a way that none of them, not Hank, not the government agents, and perhaps not even Abel himself, had fully anticipated. As tensions reached their breaking point and it seemed that violence was inevitable, Abel made a decision that revealed the true depth of his understanding of human nature and the genuine wisdom that 3 centuries of observation had taught him. He walked out of the cabin, not fleeing, not surrendering, but walking with the measured dignity that his ancient staff represented, carrying the truth scroll in his massive hands like a diplomatic document. His appearance in full daylight, no longer hiding or concealing his extraordinary nature, struck the government agents speechless. Whatever they had been expecting based on their briefings and previous encounters, the reality of Abel's presence, his obvious intelligence, his controlled movements, his unmistakable aura of ancient wisdom challenged every assumption they had brought to this mountain. "Gentlemen," Abel said, and Hank's heart nearly stopped at the sound. After months of complex vocalizations and gesture-based communication, Abel spoke in clear, carefully enunciated English that carried only the slightest accent from vocal cords not quite designed for human speech. "I believe you have been looking for me." The lead agent recovered first, though Hank could see his hands trembling as he raised what was clearly a tranquilizer weapon. "Sir, we need you to remain calm and follow our instructions. We're here to help you." Abel's response was a sound that could only be described as gentle amusement. "Agent Morrison, I have been observing your career for the past 7 years. I know about your wife's illness, your son's struggles in school, and your own doubts about the methods your organization employs in situations like this one. Do you truly believe that deception will serve any useful purpose at this point?" The personal knowledge that Abel revealed had the intended effect. The agents exchanged uncertain glances, clearly recognizing that they were dealing with something far beyond their training or experience. But it was what Abel did next that truly changed the dynamic of the confrontation. He unrolled the ancient scroll and began to read from it, his voice taking on the cadence of someone sharing knowledge that had been preserved across generations. What emerged was not mystical nonsense or cryptic prophecies, but precise scientific observations, mathematical principles, and technological concepts that were decades ahead of anything human science had achieved. "Your government seeks knowledge," Abel continued, his gaze moving between the three agents with obvious assessment of their individual characters. "I offer it freely on one condition, that it be used for the benefit of all humanity, not merely for military or economic advantage." The scroll contained detailed information about sustainable agriculture techniques that could eliminate famine, medical knowledge that could cure diseases that still plagued human civilization, and engineering principles that could revolutionize transportation and communication. But more than that, it contained philosophical insights about consciousness, intelligence, and the relationship between different thinking species that could reshape humanity's understanding of its place in the universe. Agent Morrison lowered his weapon slowly, his professional training warring with his recognition that this situation had moved far beyond anything his orders had prepared him for. "Sir, I'm not authorized to negotiate terms for..." "Then contact someone who is," Abel interrupted gently. "Because I am offering your species a gift that will determine whether we spend the next century as enemies or as allies. The choice, as it has always been, belongs to humanity." What followed was the most extraordinary diplomatic negotiation in human history, conducted on a remote mountain between beings separated by millions of years of evolutionary development, but united by intelligence and the desire to find peaceful coexistence. The government agents used their communication equipment to contact superiors, who contacted their superiors, until eventually Abel found himself in radio conversation with officials in Washington who possessed the authority to consider his unprecedented offer. The agreement they reached was complex but fundamentally simple. Abel would share portions of his accumulated knowledge in exchange for legal recognition of his status as a sentient being with rights and protections under human law. More importantly, he would serve as an ambassador between his kind, for he revealed that others of his species still survived in remote areas around the world, and human civilization, helping to establish protocols for contact and cooperation that could benefit both species. But the most significant part of the agreement was personal rather than political. Abel would be allowed to remain on the mountain, in the cabin he had come to think of as home, with the friend who had shown him that trust and genuine affection could transcend the boundaries of species and expectation. As the government agents departed with copies of selected portions of Abel's knowledge and promises, to return with formal documentation of their agreement, Hank found himself alone with his extraordinary friend in the cabin that no longer felt like a place of exile, but rather like the center of something new and hopeful. "Why?" he asked as they sat by the fire that evening, playing chess as they had done for months, but with the weight of changed circumstances making every move feel significant. "You could have asked for anything. Why choose to stay here with me?" Abel's response was in his own language now, the complex vocalizations that Hank had learned to understand as expressions of emotion too nuanced for human speech. But the meaning was clear enough. After 3 centuries of solitude, he had finally found something worth more than safety, more than knowledge, more than survival itself. He had found friendship. Outside their cabin, snow began to fall again, but this time it felt like blessing rather than isolation. The mountain that had once been Hank's retreat from the world had become something else entirely, a bridge between species, a place where impossible friendships could flourish, and a home where 2 very different beings could grow old together, sharing stories, playing chess, and marveling at the unexpected ways that life could surprise them both. in the wooden box that Abel kept beside his sleeping place, next to the ancient journal and the truth scroll. He placed one more treasure, a small carved chess piece that Hank had made for him. A king that looked nothing like any traditional design, but somehow captured perfectly the dignity and wisdom of a friend who had taught him that the most extraordinary relationships often begin with the simplest acts of kindness.